Welcome, students. Today we are covering the heart of communication, essential interpersonal skills, and a little about our topic today. Interpersonal skills are the abilities and behaviors that we use to interact and communicate with others. And in this seminar, we will cover active listening, nonverbal communication and body language, emotional intelligence, responsiveness, appropriate communication channels, and tone. So a little bit about me as your presenter. My name is Christy Hare, and I can relate to some of the students that we have with NMSU in that I am a first-generation college student as well. I have a bachelor's degree in business administration with a concentration in management, and later as an adult, I went on to get my MBA. So I work with NMSU as a career services coordinator with the global campus. I've been working in higher ed since 2017, and I've been teaching business communication at the college level since that time, including assisting students with resumes, cover letters, job searches, mock interviews, and these are all things that you can reach out to NMSU Global Career Services for assistance with. So interpersonal skills and why they are important. Good interpersonal skills allow us to create meaningful and positive interaction with others. They make our teamwork interactions more smooth and effective, and good interpersonal skills allow us to be more productive. I will be covering emotional intelligence in a later slide, so we will touch on that shortly. So let's begin with active listening. And how does that differ from listening? So active listening is listening without distractions. So this would be listening without working on a computer or without looking at a cell phone, and being completely focused on giving attention to the person that is speaking. So additionally, we want to try to avoid judging the person that is speaking, whether it's judging their attire or their grammar or any other judging components that would take away from what the message is that's being conveyed. Active listening also asks us to let the communicator finish what they're trying to say before we start formulating our response. So sometimes when a person starts talking and they are a few words into what they're explaining, sometimes we will begin to craft in our mind what we're going to say in return. What are we going to say back? So active listening asks that we allow them to finish before we move on to formulating our response. And then lastly, a good aspect of active listening is to ask the communicator to restate, or you as the receiver of the information to restate the message that you understood. So it might sound something like this. So I understand that you are saying blank, and restating it gives you an opportunity to make sure that you understood it correctly. And if you didn't, it gives an opportunity for the communicator and the receiver to be able to clear up any misunderstanding on what the message is. So there's several reasons why active listening is important. And if we practice what we have learned here, it helps to build trust with the communicator. It's helpful in resolving conflict, and it helps us to avoid misunderstandings. Next is nonverbal communication. So why be concerned with nonverbal communication? Is it really significant? So studies show that nonverbal accounts for actually 90% of the message that's conveyed. And so I can give you an example of that. If we ask someone how they're doing and their response is fine, what is the message that we actually took away from that? Their response was fine, but the way the person said it indicates that it's not fine. So we would believe the way it was said over the actual word that was said. So that goes back to what we were saying here, that 90% of the message conveyed comes from nonverbal, and in this case, tone, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So what is nonverbal? What are some examples? Nonverbal communication is facial expressions, body language, gestures, posture, eye contact, appearance, and personal space. We send messages with each of these without using our voice. And we want to be aware of the nonverbal messages that we send and making sure that that's accurate. So to give a further example related to our bullet number 2, our nonverbal is learned from our culture. So for example, according to the National Library of Medicine, in Japanese culture, people are taught not to maintain eye contact, as it may be considered disrespectful. Another example, personal space is the distance between you and others with which you're comfortable. People in the United States desire more personal space than those in many other countries. So inhabitants of countries that have large populations have grown to be comfortable with less personal space. Another example is time. If we think about time, some cultures believe that it's okay to be maybe 15 or so minutes late. That's culturally acceptable. It's fine. It's not considered disrespectful. However, in other cultures, if a person's 15 minutes late, they may not be able to meet with who they intended to meet with because it could be taken as a sign of disrespect. So we want to be aware of the cultural cues and norms for the area in which we are working and be respectful of those. Next is tone. So tone is the sound of voice the sound in your voice or in your writing. And so we think voice probably immediately, but we don't necessarily think about writing. And so we want to make sure that in our writing it conveys a proper tone and a respectful tone for the type message that we want to convey. So an example that I have here, it's, you messed up the bill. Now we're never going to get paid. So what is the tone that comes across here? So it's just words on a page, but the way that it's said is what conveys the feeling. And so you messed up the bill, we're never going to get paid, conveys, in the way that it's said, it conveys frustration, aggravation. We have the word you here, which you is confrontational. So it's a good idea to try to avoid the word you in communications. So let's look at a different example. I think there's an error here. Let's look at it and see what we can do. So the difference in the second example is more, let's look at it together. It's not pointing fingers or finding fault. It's let's look at it together and see what we can do. It's not accusational. So if you have concerns about tone, one resource that you can use is Grammarly. Grammarly has a tone detector, and this can be found at grammarly.com/tone. And you can plug in your item that you have a concern about, and then it will give you feedback on the tone of your message. Another option would be to ask a trusted friend or family member or a spouse. If you have a message that you need to convey, you can share the message with them and say, how would you take this? How do you respond to this message? And that will help you understand the way that it may be perceived by the receiver. The key there is make sure that you are sharing your message with a trusted source who's going to give you true feedback. So some of us may have friends that tell us, looks good, looks great, everything we do is great. That's not necessarily what we're looking for in this instance. We want someone who's going to be honest with us and give us a true picture of um, our information. So in choosing that person, you want to think about who is going to be honest with me. Then we want to choose an appropriate channel for our message. With a written message, we do not have the tone or the facial expressions or the body language to help us interpret the message accurately. So one example that I like has to deal with or has to do with reading a book. So, and we can find that in the second bullet at the bottom. So multiple readers can read a message and interpret it differently. For example, reading a book. We have, let's just say, a book off the bestseller list. There may be thousands of people, maybe more, that are going to read that book. And some people are going to think it's great. And other people are going to think maybe it was not great. Maybe even that it was terrible. But if we look at what the item is, it's a book. It's words on a page. It's the exact same words on a page for every single person that reads it. Yet some people will interpret it as good and others will interpret it as poor. And so we want to also kind of take that into consideration when we are conveying our messages. And when we choose an appropriate communication channel, we want to choose a channel which helps us to avoid any miscommunications or misunderstandings. And so a good rule of thumb to consider when you have a message that there's the possibility, even a possibility, that it could be misunderstood, it's better to reserve those type of messages for phone or in person or for a virtual meeting, such as using Teams or Zoom or Google Meet or some type of virtual meeting option such as that. That way it gives your receiver of your communication the opportunity to view your facial expressions, your tone of voice, and helps the receiver understand how the message was intended. Maybe the message was not intended the way that it was interpreted. So again, a good rule of thumb, anytime you have a message that can be misunderstood, the best idea is to choose phone or in-person or virtual meeting as your channel to convey that message so that we can avoid any type of misunderstanding that might cause a strained relationship. Responsiveness. So why is it important to be responsive? So if we delay a response to a message that we receive, whether it's on purpose or whether we got busy and it was an accident, it can affect the productivity of the person who sent the message. So it's very important to make sure that we are responsive to the messages that we receive because we do not want it to delay someone else from being able to be as productive as they can be. In other words, we don't want to hold them up from accomplishing what they need to accomplish because they're waiting on a response from us. Emotional intelligence. So we touched on this just briefly in the beginning. So let's first talk about what it is. So emotional intelligence is being aware of your emotions and how others perceive you. So how might others view you? What is their impression of you? How would they describe you? So what if we don't know the answer to that? How can we know? How can we find that out? So again, I would say go back to that trusted source, that person that you know is going to be honest with you, whether it's a friend, a family member, a spouse, and you can ask that question. And I would also encourage you that if you have not done that, to maybe take a moment and choose that trusted source and ask that question, because we may believe that we're perceived in a certain way. However, when we ask someone, it might be different than what we thought that the perception of us was. And so it's a good idea just to ask that question to a trusted source and get an answer to that. Now, we have some tips for improving emotional intelligence. And first, we have being self-aware. So we want to be aware of our communication, be aware of our emotions. If we're going to be in a situation where we think there's the potential to maybe become angry or upset, that we prepare ourselves in advance of that, if we can, for how we're going to respond in an appropriate way. Then we want to consider how others or the receiver of your message might feel once they receive your message. How do you believe they're going to take it? How might they feel? Being willing to accept criticism and take responsibility. Moving on after a mistake is made, whether you made the mistake or whether somebody else did. Being open to feedback. Keeping a positive attitude. And then finally, those active listening skills that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So now let's put into practice kind of what we have talked about. So we have a scenario here of emailing a professor to ask a question. And in our email, we have in the subject line grade. And then we have our message to the instructor. Hey, I'm in your class, and I was wondering why you gave me a 50 on the assignment. So if we look at this, what are some issues that we might see with this communication to an instructor? So first, let's look at the subject. So we see only the word grade. So a couple of things here. We want to look at when we're communicating with an instructor, likely instructors are teaching more than one class. So we want to be very specific with the information that we are asking instructors about. We want to give a section number and an assignment number, as much detail as we can provide the instructor so they can go right to where we are asking them to take a look. The particular class identifier, and that saves some back and forth of the instructor having to say, can you give me some more information? I'm teaching multiple sections or multiple classes. So let's give a detailed subject of what we are specifically asking for. And then let's move on to our message. So, hey might be an acceptable response for a text message to a friend, something along those lines. Hey is not an acceptable greeting for an instructor. So we would want to find out if our instructor has a doctorate, and if the instructor does have a doctorate, we would address them by doctor unless they have told us not to. And a good way to find out if that is the case is to look at your syllabus, and your instructor will likely list their education credentials there. If your instructor has a doctorate, then they will say Dr. such and such, and that way you will know to address them in that manner. If we don't know or we're unsure, then we can say Mr. or Ms., capital MS period, if we are unsure, Mr. or Ms. All right, and then onto our message, starting a sentence with lowercase I. So at this point, you're college students, and we want to make sure that we're utilizing all of those wonderful grammatical skills that we have learned prior to this point, and using proper punctuation and grammar. So capital I am in your class. Again, be specific as to which class it is and which section it is. And capital I, was wondering why you. Remember, we talked about midway through the presentation about you and that being confrontational. So let's think about a different wording that we can use there, such as I wonder why I received a 50 on the assignment. And again, we want to be very specific as to what the assignment is. We're talking about a semester's worth of assignments. That could be a number of different things. So we want to be very, very specific in that. All right, and then putting into plan the things that we've learned today. How can we put into action what we've learned today and use this as a roadmap to achieve our goals? And then finally, my contact information is listed here. You have my office telephone, my email address, our web address at Global NMSU. So I would love to hear from you if you have any feedback, or if you would like to talk further about the information shared in this presentation. I would encourage you to reach out with any questions. And thank you so much for your attention.